They thought she was just another black woman in the wrong place, with the wrong story at the wrong time. What they didn't know was that the handcuffed suspect in their backseat wasn't just innocent. She was a federal agent sent to expose dirty cops exactly like them. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. It was the beginning of their downfall. Because while they were busy planting drugs and flexing power they didn't earn, she was memorizing faces, logging behavior, and baiting them into a trap they didn't even know existed. This story isn't about a woman trying to prove her innocence. It's about a woman who let the wolves think they were winning until she pulled the badge that outranked them all. And if you think this ends in a courtroom gavel, you're only half right. What happened next was not only a lesson for the aggressors, but also a powerful reminder of empathy, responsibility, and the ongoing fight for equal dignity. We're about to share a powerful moment of truth. But first, drop your location and let us know, have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Highway 82 was the kind of forgotten American back road that stretched like an old scar across the map. Long, quiet, and hiding stories nobody bothered to tell. On that Saturday evening, the sky over Alabama was burning orange, the kind of dusk that made even broken things look golden. Tasha Ellison didn't just drive this stretch, she studied it. Her playlist rolled soft jazz through the speakers, her seatbelt clicked, her phone set to do not disturb. No perfume, no makeup, no flair. Just clean khakis, a gray sweater, and the calm precision of a woman who'd been trained to notice the details nobody else did. To the outside world, she was just another quiet face in a reliable Toyota heading west. But inside that car was a mind cataloging time, tags, and tire treads. Because she never drove without watching who watched her. When the lights hit her rearview mirror, she didn't flinch. No sudden movements, no questions. She blinked once, signaled, and coasted gently onto the shoulder, like she had all the patience in the world. She placed both hands on the wheel, rolled her window down, and waited. The officer who approached didn't offer a greeting, didn't even look her in the eye. "License and registration," he said, voice flat as the road behind them. She gave it to him. He didn't thank her, just glanced at the trunk and asked if she was alone, where she was coming from, what was in the back. "Medical conference in Montgomery." "Luggage, work files," she answered. He tapped her roof. "Pop it." She paused. "Is there a reason?" His hand hovered near his holster. "You got a problem?" "No." Her voice was level. Button pressed, trunk opened, and just like that the line was drawn. That's when officer number 2 arrived. Thicker build, mirrored sunglasses even though the sun was slipping. They opened her trunk like it was theirs. No warrant, no cause, no hesitation. She watched them through the side mirror, their heads dipping in and out of frame like vultures, deciding whether she was worth the effort. Then came the command, "Step out of the vehicle." No explanation, just authority delivered like a slap. "Excuse me?" she asked. "Step out now." She complied, slowly. "We found a controlled substance," they said. "Cocaine." She blinked. "No, you didn't." The cuffs came next. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "I don't consent to this search," she said, louder now. "I'm not resisting, but you're making a mistake." They didn't listen. They never do. Click, click, medal on wrist. "You'll explain it to the judge," said the one called Callan. Sharp, the other, just smirked. They shoved her into the back of the car like she was some rag doll with a fake alibi. She sat still in the back seat, breathing shallow, not from fear, but calculation. While they laughed up front about how they always claim they're clean, she was calculating. Timelines, badge numbers, voice tones, everything. Her real ID was buried beneath the lining of her suitcase. Her encrypted burner phone hadn't been touched. The operation she'd been building for nearly a year now had 2 fresh names with fingerprints all over it. That they thought they'd caught a suspect, But all they'd done was expose themselves to a woman trained to tear corruption out by the roots. These men weren't just arrogant, they were sloppy. And what they didn't realize was they weren't walking her into jail. They were walking into federal jurisdiction. And when that curtain lifted, the only thing getting booked would be them. The booking station smelled like bleach and betrayal. That mix of sterilized effort and moral rot. The kind that clung to your clothes longer than any inmate number ever would. The floor was damp, the lights too bright, flickering just enough to feel intentional. Tasha was walked through the intake doors like every other catch they processed that night. Her cuffs stayed on longer than necessary. Her name was called with just enough disdain to be noticed. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The uniformed clerk behind the desk didn't make eye contact when he asked her height and weight. He barely looked up from his keyboard when she answered, and the second she mentioned pharmaceuticals as her profession, he muttered, "Another one with excuses." That's the thing about power. It doesn't need volume. It needs a pattern. And this place had one. You could feel it in the way every face looked bored, as if processing people was just another form of copy-pasting misery. The strip search was as routine as it was revolting. A fluorescent-lit room, a steel bench, a female deputy who looked like she'd long ago stopped registering embarrassment, hers or anyone else's. Tasha stood still, arms raised. The deputy's gloves snapped on with the same indifference you'd expect from someone checking produce at the grocery store. "Squat," she said, flatly, not cruel, just mechanical, like she'd said it 1,000 times and had stopped wondering whether it mattered. Tasha didn't blink. Dignity peeled like wallpaper no one bothers to fix. Quietly, layer by layer, until the surface looks like something it never agreed to become. When it was over, they handed her an orange two-piece that smelled like detergent and resentment. Too big in the waist, frayed at the cuffs. She dressed slow. Every motion was deliberate, steady, controlled. They wanted discomfort to do the talking. She let silence do it better. They sat her on a cold bench beside a buzzing vending machine with nothing in it but dust and broken promises. Across from her, a gum-snapping receptionist thumbed through a gossip magazine like she wasn't sitting feet away from a federal operation in disguise. But Tasha wasn't focused on them. She was inventorying. Every badge name, every clock tick, every camera dome in every corner. Her eyes moved, without turning her head. A black dome above the far wall, probably 30% blind spot. One guard kept glancing at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Another whispered something to a deputy and chuckled. She counted their steps, memorized their cadence, their boots. You don't have to shout when your truth is loaded, she thought, and hers had a silencer built into every breath. Let them laugh. Let them assume they were writing a story she had authored a year ago, and now they were scribbling their confessions onto her case file without even realizing the ink was permanent. Later that night, they moved her to a holding cell with 6 other women. No introductions, just glances and shifting weight. A young girl, couldn't have been more than 20, sat near the wall, knees pulled to her chest. She looked at Tasha like a stranger she might recognize later. "You knew?" she asked. Tasha nodded once. "Just passing through." The girl smirked. "Aren't we all?" The others barely noticed her, too tired, too familiar with the cycle to care. One woman had a tear-stained face. Another snored quietly through a swollen lip. The guards walked past like warehouse employees, ignoring damaged goods. Tasha watched them, watching nothing. She became a mirror to their apathy. She said nothing, gave no reason to engage, just absorbed the scene like evidence. Because that's exactly what it was. Every careless word, every half-joke, every dropped form or delayed meal, it all told a story, and she'd be the one to file it. He kept track of time by the flicker in the light and the slam of vending machine buttons that never worked. Around midnight, she ran every checklist in her head. Her encrypted burner was still in the glove compartment. Her real ID was sewn under the lining of her suitcase. Her alias, Tasha Ellison, pharmaceutical consultant, was clean and convincing. But her handler, Roy Talbert, wasn't expecting to hear from her until Monday. She was off-grid officially, and that meant no calls, no check-ins, no cavalry. She leaned her head back against the concrete wall and let out a slow breath. Good, she thought. Let them dig their own grave. Every second they kept her here, every new lie they told, every chain they added to a story they thought they controlled, it all became another shovel in their hands. And she? She was just the soil they'd have to answer to. The next morning started with a voice too casual for the setting. "You, Allison?" A deputy stood in the doorway, one eyebrow lifted like he was too bored to be suspicious. Tasha nodded and stood, wrists already behind her back. She was walked down a narrow hallway that smelled like reheated sausage biscuits and stale copy paper, into a small side room with a metal chair bolted to the floor and a man who looked like he'd once lost a fight with an office supply closet. "Name's Ben Ridley," he said, setting down a folder with no confidence and too much coffee on his breath. "You can call me Ben." He gave her a look that tried to be reassuring and failed halfway through. "I won't lie to you," he said, flipping through pages like they were someone else's bad news. "These are serious charges. Possession with intent, they say it was bagged and labeled." Tasha tilted her head, watching him. "Do you believe them?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter if I do. Judge you're seeing? Old school. Doesn't like surprise defendants. I'll try to get bail, but it's going to come down to whether what they say was found actually was." He scratched his beard, avoiding her eyes. "They say you had drugs in your suitcase? Cocaine?" She folded her fingers together. "I didn't." Ben offered a thin smile. "Yeah, well, half the jail says that." He looked down again, voice trailing. "You're not from here. That's not going to help." And just like that, she knew. Ben Ridley was the kind of man who folds under a paper cut. By mid-morning, 2 guards came for her again. This time they didn't say much, just guided her into another plain room with no clock, no windows, and the same 2 names stitched into uniforms she'd committed to memory. Colin and Sharp were already inside, arms crossed like playground bullies who thought detention meant dominance. Sharp leaned against the far wall, sunglasses pushed up on his head, smirk glued on. Colin took the lead. "We took another look through your stuff last night," he said. "Found something interesting." Sharp held up a second phone, the encrypted burner she hadn't touched since Thursday. "Want to tell us what this is for?" Tasha didn't flinch. "That's personal property." "No warrant," Sharp chuckled. "You think you're in a position to throw around legal terms?" Callan stepped closer, his grin tight. "You're the one caught with a half-ounce of coke and a spy phone. Don't start talking like a lawyer." Tasha kept her gaze steady. "You planted that." The words landed flat, but something in Sharp's face twitched. Just a flicker. Callan grinned wider, the kind of grin men wear when they think intimidation is the same thing as authority. "You're lucky we didn't add obstruction. Hell, you didn't even smile." "I didn't resist either," she replied. "Not that it matters to you." Sharp took a slow step forward, voice low. "You think you're smarter than us?" Tasha blinked once. "I know I am." The room got quieter after that. Not still, just charged, like the second before lightning picks a side. Callan cocked his head, leaned against the desk like he was settling in for a game he thought he'd already won. "You got an answer for everything, huh? Okay, let's say this ain't your first time. Maybe you're a courier. Maybe you've done this loop before. Mobile, Jackson, Starkville. Little hot zones full of addicts and pills. You've seen the pattern." Tasha stared back, lips calm. "Yeah, I've seen a pattern. 2 officers who work overtime, always the last to sign off. Who sees just enough narcotics to report, but not enough to explain what never makes it to evidence. I've seen how they make small stops look big on paper. I've seen how some arrests vanish before arraignment, how charges mysteriously drop when the suspect's from out of town and doesn't have a lawyer who fights." Sharp's smirk cracked. Callan's eyes narrowed, but he kept his mouth shut. "You're not wolves," she said evenly. "Wolves have rules. You're vultures in uniform. You circle the weak and congratulate each other when they don't scream loud enough to be heard." Callan stepped forward. "Careful, you're not exactly in a position to make threats." "I'm not threatening you," she said, her voice almost soft. "I'm describing you." From the corner, movement. Officer Reyes had entered quietly, clipboard in hand, pretending to sort documents. He paused mid-step, eyes locked on her as she spoke. Tasha didn't look at him directly, but she knew. Truth has a smell, and Reyes caught a whiff. His posture shifted, only slightly, but enough. He didn't chuckle at Callan's next joke. He didn't nod when Sharp made a crack about mouthy women. He just listened. Watched. He was the first real crack in the wall they thought was built airtight. Tasha saw it, filed it away. She'd seen men like him before, torn between loyalty and discomfort, walking the edge between complicity and conscience. He wouldn't speak now, but he would remember. And later, when it counted, maybe he'd choose the right side. The conversation wound down with no resolution, no answers, just tension hanging like smoke in a locked room. Sharp dropped the burner phone into a plastic evidence bag and zipped it like a man putting away a problem he didn't want to understand. Callan gave her a last look, something between annoyance and caution, then signaled the guard. "She's going back to holding. We'll see what the judge says." They didn't say goodbye. Tasha didn't either. On the way out, she passed Reyes in the hallway. He didn't move, just watched her as she walked. His eyes flicked down to the cuffs, then back up to her face. She held his gaze for a second, steady, then kept walking. "They brought me here thinking I was prey. Turns out..." 5 years earlier, she sat in a Memphis cafe with peeling window tint and chipped mugs that made the coffee taste like steel. Her name that day was Latrice Monroe. She was a dropout with a sealed juvenile record, a parolee boyfriend, and just enough street grit to make dealers trust her, but not so much they'd question her presence. The waitress had called her baby and poured her a second cup on instinct. Across the room, Derek Vaughn pretended to read a newspaper, but he was watching the exits. Tasha, no Latrice, didn't blink. She stirred her sugar slow, played with her hoop earring, and let him make the first move. That day wasn't about arresting him. It was about watching the way he moved, what he didn't say, what number he redialed after pretending he forgot the last one. DEA work didn't look like it did in the movies. It looked like this. Silence thick enough to write names on, waiting long enough for people to think you've forgotten, letting the lie crawl all the way out before you step on its tail. She wore names like armor, each one tighter than the last. Tasha, Latrice, Monica, Janine. A woman with no accent and 5 backstories. She disappeared into lives that never made it to paper, then walked out with the truth hanging off her like perfume. By the time she turned 30, her file at the agency didn't have accolades, it had legends. They called her the Ghost, but not because she vanished. She lingered. She listened. She let men confess to her without even knowing they were bleeding. She didn't crack cases. She evaporated into them. There were no gunfights, no car chases, just a network of whispers and a woman who knew how to disappear behind the right tone of voice. Her gift wasn't disguise, it was patience. People assumed silence meant submission. She let them. She understood that arrogance always overplays its hand, and when it does, it's loud. When people don't think you're dangerous, they brag, they slip up, they try to impress. And that's when you close the net. That's when you smile in your secondhand blouse and pretend you've never seen a badge in your life. Her cases didn't end with applause. They ended with indictments, with files thicker than Bibles, with agents saying, "Wait, you were there?" She'd learned early that power isn't what people see, it's what they never even notice. The investigation that led her to Callan and Sharp started like most of them, quiet. A missing bag of evidence in Marengo County. A case dropped before a hearing. a sealed transcript that didn't stay sealed long enough. Then 2 names came up more than once. Officers with identical testimonies in unrelated arrests. Travel routes that always seemed to pass through their jurisdiction. The drugs seized never matched the paperwork. Charges got reduced before paperwork was even complete. Victims were mostly out of state. Working class, female, easy to discredit. Easy to forget. DEA flagged it as coincidence. Tasha didn't. She saw the rhythm, the timing, the convenience. She saw how Callan worked the late shifts, how Sharp signed off on evidence logs with his left hand like he didn't want it traced. So she stepped in. Not as an agent, but as bait, created a life, crafted a travel schedule, a pharmaceutical consultant who always drove, who carried locked luggage, who was too quiet and too alone. The kind of woman a corrupt cop might think twice about, but not enough to stop himself. What she hadn't predicted was how fast they'd jump. She thought she'd have a few more weeks of observation, a few more traffic cameras, but vultures don't wait when they smell weakness, and she'd looked exactly how they wanted her to. Professional, tired, and alone. Just another woman in a rental car. Her father used to say, "Never yell when you can whisper and still be heard." He'd been a firefighter in Jackson, Mississippi, the kind who didn't need a siren to command a room. He'd told her once that silence isn't weakness, it's discipline, that the loudest ones are usually the least certain. She held on to that, made it her method. In rooms where men screamed orders, she blinked slow and took notes. When they tried to provoke her, she tilted her head and made them repeat themselves. Now she sat in the dark while they shined flashlights on each other's lies. Her jumpsuit still smelled like chemicals and regret. One of the guards had made a joke about her cold eyes. Another asked what kind of name Ellison was. She didn't flinch, didn't answer. Let them assume. Assumption was their weakness. She'd weaponized it. While they filled out forms and bragged about another win, she was ticking boxes in her head. Body cam angles, report timing, slip-ups in language. She didn't need to run. She didn't need to argue. All she had to do was stay exactly where they put her, because the deeper they dragged her down, the more rope they were handing her to tie around their own necks. The morning of the hearing was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that crawled up from the floor and into your bones like it was trying to make you doubt yourself before you even opened your mouth. Tasha was led from the holding cell, through a hallway of peeling paint and slouched bailiffs, each one more disinterested than the last. Her wrists and ankles were shackled this time, the clink of chains echoing through the corridor like punctuation marks on someone else's lie. Ben Ridley, her public defender, still hadn't looked her in the eye. He walked ahead of her with a file under one arm like he was carrying someone else's groceries. When they entered the courtroom, it wasn't grand. It was tired. Beige walls, cracked ceiling fans, a clerk who looked like he'd lost a bet. Tasha sat down at the defense table while Ben muttered something about just stay quiet, as if silence was a new concept to her. The prosecutor shuffled papers like he was auditioning for the role of someone important. They built the lie like IKEA furniture, cheap and full of screws. Everyone played their part. And Tasha? She watched the show. Callan took the stand first, straightening his posture like he'd just remembered he had one. We observed erratic driving behavior. Vehicle made a sudden shift, no signal. Upon approach, the suspect seemed evasive, inconsistent in her answers. He kept his eyes on the judge, never once looking at Tasha. With probable cause, we requested a trunk search, at which point the suspect hesitated. After gaining access, we discovered a substance, later confirmed to be cocaine. Judge Beckwith, a man who looked like a walrus in a bathrobe, nodded slowly, uninterested but not unconvinced. Any resistance? Minimal, Callan said, casually. She tried to argue, claimed the bag wasn't hers, also refused to identify the second phone. It was rehearsed, tidy, like they'd practiced it in the mirror with matching smirks. Then Sharp took the stand, delivering his lines with that same vacant professionalism. The phone was encrypted. Civilian-grade phones don't use that level of security. When questioned, she refused to provide her employer's name. Her behavior was suspicious, defensive. He spoke like a man ordering coffee, bored by the menu. They lied like they'd paid rent on deception. And no one in that courtroom seemed interested in asking for a receipt. Judge Beckwith leaned back in his chair. "Well, appears we have a textbook case of courier activity. Bail is denied. She will be remanded until further notice." The gavel hadn't even dropped when the back doors creaked open, and in walked Justice, wearing a charcoal suit and a stare that unbuttons lies. "Your Honor," said the man as he moved toward the bench, calm as Sunday morning but sharp as barbed wire. "My name is Special Agent Roy Talbot, DEA." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His badge wasn't in his hand. It was in the authority of his tone. The judge squinted, irritated by the interruption. "Excuse me." Talbot reached into his briefcase and pulled out a black folder. "You're going to want to read this off the record now." He passed the folder across. Silence dropped like a curtain. Callan froze. Sharp blinked, his confidence shrinking like fabric in hot water. Even Ben Ridley straightened in his seat. The judge flipped through the documents, his lips moving as he read. His eyebrows dropped lower with each page. Then he looked up. "Court is in recess. Everyone out except Agent Talbot and Miss Ellison." Inside chambers, the air changed. The courtroom tension gave way to something heavier. Reality. The judge sat down slowly as Talbot spread out a thin stack of documents like a dealer laying down a royal flush. "Miss Ellison," he began, "is a federally embedded DEA agent who's been undercover for nearly a year investigating a pattern of internal corruption tied to narcotics theft by local law enforcement. The arrest in question is not just improper, it's a deliberate obstruction of an active federal operation." The judge's eyes scanned the clearance letter, the sealed warrants, the project name, Operation Grey Cut. Tasha stood beside Talbot without saying a word. She didn't need to. The pages did the talking. They arrested the badge, she thought, not the woman. Talbot slid a flash drive across the table. "You'll want to view the body cam footage before it disappears from precinct servers. You'll see Callan hand off a bag that didn't come from her car. You'll hear Sharp mention the burner before it was even found." The judge said nothing, just kept flipping, his jaw tightening with each confirmation. Back in the courtroom, the silence was louder than before. The judge stepped up to the bench, his face carved out of stone now. "After reviewing new evidence submitted by federal authorities, all charges against Miss Ellison are hereby dismissed, effective immediately." Callan jerked his head toward the judge like someone had thrown a rock at him. Sharp opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You two will remain in this courthouse under supervision," the judge added, "until federal investigators complete their interviews." Callan tried to speak. "You don't understand. She had—" "Enough," the judge snapped. "I don't want to hear another word from either of you." The gavel hit the block. "Court is adjourned." In that moment, the whole room shifted. Not because Tasha said anything, but because she didn't need to. The truth was already doing laps around their lies. She stood, the chains gone, the orange uniform just a memory. Talbot followed her out without a word. The prosecutor looked like someone had stolen his lunch. Ben Ridley finally exhaled. And as for Callan and Sharp, they stood where they'd once smiled, now silent, now sweating, now exactly where they belonged. Bail denied? How about employment denied? The lie didn't just collapse, it got evicted. And justice? She walked out the door in heels. Tasha stepped out of the courthouse with no cuffs, no guards, no more borrowed time. Just a simple navy suit and the kind of stillness that speaks louder than thunder. The cameras weren't there, the headlines hadn't caught up yet, but the people who mattered, they felt it. The deputies who used to smirk when she passed now stood stiff with uncertainty. She didn't glare, she didn't gloat. She walked straight through the front doors like she belonged there. and always had. Callan and Sharp, once full of swagger, now sat in separate rooms on opposite sides of the same sinking ship, their badges stripped, their futures under forensic review. They wore fear like loose shoes, unsure whether to run or trip. Tasha? She walked barefoot with purpose. No rattling keys, no statement to the press, no need to explain. The silence said everything. The next 48 hours moved like a machine finally oiled. At the federal field office outside Demopolis, Tasha and Talbot dove into the mess. Screens flickered with maps marked by color-coded pins. Each pin told a story. A stop that didn't make sense, a search that wasn't logged, a defendant who disappeared into a plea deal without a lawyer or a chance. Files poured in from other counties, Choctaw, same patterns. Same shadows. GPS logs showed evidence room access long after hours. Property reports marked destroyed that were never documented leaving the shelves. Tasha cross-referenced Sharp's keycard swipes with missing inventory records. One folder showed a stash of oxycodone from a bust in Meridian that vanished without trace. And then there was the phone. Hers. Still locked. Still untouched. Not a breadcrumb out of place. They'd tried to turn it into a weapon against her. Instead, it became the brick that cracked their whole wall. It wasn't revenge she wanted. It was accuracy. Every thread followed. Every lie logged. This wasn't about two men. It was about a system that looked the other way too many times for it to be an accident. 3 weeks later, she sat across from a woman named Denise Holloway in a tiny living room that smelled of boiled coffee and stale hope. Denise had served 9 months in a state facility on charges that now, thanks to Tasha's file, were fully dismissed. Her public defender had missed 2 court dates. Her arresting officer had been Sharp. Denise cried for nearly 10 minutes before she could say thank you. Another woman, a mother of 4 named Lucia, had nearly lost custody because of a plea she never should have had to take. Tasha handed her a folder. Legal aid, housing support, a contact who'd walk with her into the next phase of life. No cameras, no announcements. Just quiet restoration. Justice isn't a sentence, Tasha said gently. It's a door that shouldn't have been locked. These weren't just names on a board. They were lives rerouted. People who'd been silenced and finally heard. For Tasha, this was the only part that mattered. Not the takedown, not the courtroom drama, the follow-through, the correction. The fact that maybe, just maybe, they could walk with their heads high again. Back in Jackson, her apartment greeted her like it had missed her but didn't want to admit it. The lights were still set to timers. Her plants, somehow still alive, leaned toward the window like nothing had happened. The suitcase from that night sat in the corner of the hallway, unopened. She finally unzipped it and pulled out the gray blazer she'd worn during the arrest. Folded, worn, too quiet for what it had witnessed, she tossed it into a box marked evidence. Not for court, just for herself. That evening she sat on her back porch with a mug of tea, listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood that didn't ask questions. There was no siren in the air, no badge in her lap, just her, the sky, and a breeze that didn't care who she was or what she'd survived. Silence is peace, her father used to say, when you know what your name weighs. And now she did. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd refused to let them take it. She looked out at the trees and thought of all the moments they tried to erase her. That instant the cuffs clicked, the way they smirked as if her story was theirs to write. But they wrote in chalk, soft, temporary, easy to wash away when it rained. She answered in pen, permanent, pressed hard enough to bleed through the next page. You don't survive something like that to get even. You survive it to get clear. And once you're clear, you don't whisper your story. You speak it like a closing argument, not to convince them, but to remind yourself that you were right to stand tall, right to wait, right to stay quiet until the room was quiet enough to hear you. They thought they could define her with a charge, but her truth outlived their narrative. Her patience exposed their patterns. And her silence? It was never surrender. If you're watching this and you've ever been told to shrink, to be still, to stay small so someone else could feel big, remember this. They don't get to end your sentence. You do. So if someone tries to write your story for you, grab the pen and finish it yourself. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from. And if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.